Hey guys, so this week we are picking up with the fifth questions and answers video in our study of SR4, Satan's World System from Ichthys. So in the teaching lesson this week, we had gone over these points here, so that the futility problem is not solved in modern times, and that human desire is insatiable. And so actually the points that we're going to be going over today in the questions and answers video are related to these two. And actually, here's the outline. We also talked about, just tying things back to the idea of the fallen world and contrasting it with Eden, the wider context of our study that we brought up in the introduction to this series. But these were the main points we talked about, right? This idea that even though humanity has made progress in fighting diseases and starvation and elimination of wars, I actually watched the video and I was kind of sheepish, man. I said World War II was in the 40s and 50s. World War II was most certainly in the 40s, ended in 45, but can't really go back and edit that out. So there you have it. But so despite all this progress that we as humans have made, well, at no time in history have we had these trends accelerating as they are now. So apathy, depression, and suicide. We're going to be revisiting these things today. And we argued here in our teaching lesson that the increase in these areas was on account of people having more free time and leisure time without having to be struggling to survive. So without their attention so focused on just getting by and meeting their basic needs, well, humans have more time to think. And when they have more time to think, the futility of life, the pointlessness of the world stares them in the face more. And then these things are consequences of that. Results of living a life without God, a life without purpose, adrift in the universe. So that's one point. And then we also talked about the insatiability of human desire. And we said, no matter how much humans have, they always want more. And we talked about especially how if you have something in your hands, well, it kind of loses its shine. It loses its attractiveness, because that's just what human nature is. We always want the things we don't have. We always want the things we can't have, right? The unattained and the unattainable. And that's just how human desire works. So today we're going to be just kind of riffing on these two things to a somewhat higher degree here. So I'm actually going to start doing outlines in these videos too, in as much as we actually do go over some stuff that I prepared beforehand, with the opportunity to go off and talk about other things too, if that's what people want to do. But here are the points that we're going to be making in our questions and answers video today. So the first one here that we're going to pick up with is actual data on apathy and depression and suicide. So those results of staring pointlessness in the face, the consequences of the hopelessness of life here that people come to see in this present world. So we're going to hit each one specifically. I pull out a page for each one, just one source. I'm not going super rigorous here. I'm just introducing the concepts because there's plenty of research out there to support these things, without us necessarily having to go prove it in a completely rigorous fashion here, because like I said, it's not like these points are particularly controversial. The data exists for them, but we're just going to go ahead and introduce the topic here. And then we're just going to use this to strengthen the conclusion we already made, that even though we as humanity have made progress, well, we still have this futility. This life lived without God is still pointless for us as humans. And given that people have more time nowadays, well, that can help explain why these things are on the rise. After all of this, we're going to be handling this thing right here, the idea that, well, some people are skeptical that the rich and wealthy and people who have much in this world are actually dissatisfied or that they have any problems, right? So we're going to be talking about this sentiment that, well, if I had all the things that they had, I would certainly be happy and grateful, and I would be a good moral person and not desire ever more, on top of the excess that I already possess, right? People think this, that if only I were rich, I would be a moral rich person. I'd be a good rich person, and I wouldn't covet things that are even more luxurious on top of what I already had. So we're going to be addressing that sentiment and why that's actually dangerous. And we'll get to that later. But this comparison to others, especially looking down on others and saying that we do better, well, that's a hypothetical reality that doesn't exist. And so we don't actually know. There's no way for us to be completely certain. So these are the things we're going to talk about today. All right, so picking up here on this idea of actual data for these things that we mentioned here. So apathy and emptiness, depression and suicide, the consequences of realizing and pondering and contemplating the futility of life in the physical world, right? Life without God. So during the lesson, I mentioned that these symptoms here of human hopelessness are rapidly increasing, even despite all the positive noises people make about how much humanity has progressed. So that's a very popular modern sentiment that we are the most advanced and progressed that we've ever been as humans. And look at all of the bad things we've eliminated and oh, go us, pat us on the back as humans. Well, even despite all of that, and despite the rah-rah humanity speeches that people give, well, it so happens that in modern industrialized countries, these things are actually increasing, not decreasing. And this presents this great paradox of, well, isn't technology and affluence and leisure time supposed to bring us happiness, right? Well, why is it bringing us instead apathy and depression and suicide, right? These consequences of unhappiness. And so, as I said in the basic introduction here, it doesn't really take too much internet research to verify the claims that we're making here. It's not like we're making stuff up and you have to go through some esoteric argument to make these points, because this is actually what the data supports. We're not drawing grand conclusions. We're just following the actual statistics. But even with this being said, I could just leave it as something that people can go verify on their own time, but so as not to be hand wavy, we're going to spend a little bit of time here in the questions and answers video, just going through and supporting the idea that yes, these things are actually, as we said, they are increasing, they are bad to the degree that we're making points off of here. Now, I do encourage anyone who has more than a passing interest here to go ahead and verify in more depth things we talk about. Like as I said, we're only going to be using a single source here just to get the main idea across, but also just to go even on top of what we talk about today, just go even further into studying the consequences of people contemplating the pointlessness of life, right? The mental harm it causes for people to not accept the truth, not be willing to turn to God, and instead have to grapple with the existential questions in life. So if they don't believe in God and the purpose and meaning that we have from our existence as Christians, well, then what are the consequences of that unbelief? And one final note here before we get into the actual things we're going to examine is that these statistics do vary by culture. And a good example here is that while global suicide rates have actually been on the decline in the past several decades, particularly China and India having an effect here, right? Declining rates there have a big effect because of their large populations. Well, even given that, suicide rates have been steadily increasing in the United States from the 1990s, for example. So these things do vary by culture. But the point that we've been making is actually that it is the wealthy, industrialized first world countries where we have this technology and affluence and leisure time that these things are increasing, which actually fits with our hypothesis, our spiritual hypothesis here, completely perfectly. So of the three consequences of staring futility in the face, we're going to look at apathy and emptiness first, right? So you may also hear the word ennui, E-N-N-U-I, that French word meaning along the same lines, right? The purposelessness of life. So we have this first link here talking about exactly what feeling empty is. There was a research study that went through and interviewed people who self-identified as feeling this way. And so I'm not going to actually go through the whole thing, that would take some time, but I pulled out some good quotes here. So this is just a piece introducing this idea of apathy and emptiness and the degree to which they are presently affecting humanity. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the quotes here. These are kind of long, but it's much better than reading the whole thing in this presentation. So introductory quote on exactly what is this emptiness. So they say, quote, hundreds of participants described the same feeling. We found that emptiness was characterized by a sense of inner void, coupled with lack of purpose in life and a sense of disconnection to the people in their lives and the world around them. This left people feeling that they were, quote, going through the motions and not able to contribute to the world and their lives as they would like. So that's the general sense of emptiness that we're talking about here. And for us as Christians, we can immediately identify this as the lack of purpose that people have if they don't follow God. So without the purpose that we gain from our lives as Christians, people are kind of adrift, not to put too fine a point on it, but they're kind of just waiting to die because nothing that they do in life will ultimately matter. Nothing will be remembered, as we've talked about in previous discussions here in our study. So people are alive, they're in the world, but they have a time limit and nothing they do will last past their lives. So that is the consequence here. And this is how people feel in that state. And so here, a bit more examination of the findings of the study, also from the same source here. So I'm just gonna go ahead and read these couple of paragraphs here as well. So, quote, our findings lead us to believe emptiness is far more widespread than previously recognized. Feelings of emptiness can be experienced by anyone regardless of their mental health history, and for some it can be chronic and life-threatening. This experience is clearly complex, impacting every aspect of a person's life and relationships. Until now, emptiness has received little attention from mental health researchers, but our research has now given a new definition to this feeling and has highlighted the seriousness of this experience for the people who are affected. Our research also suggests that it might be time to change the way we think about mental health, distress, and the support offered, as many people struggle with emptiness regardless of whether they've been diagnosed with a mental health condition or not. So a couple points based on these paragraphs here, far more widespread than previously recognized. Well, that's important vis-a-vis our hypothesis here of the consequences of not following God spiritually, but also they say that it hasn't been recognized by mental health researchers. And this is part of the reason why it can go unrecognized is because one of the handbooks, at least here in the West, that people use to identify mental health problems is called the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So at time of writing, they're on DSM-5, which was published in 2013. And this is the handbook where people diagnose by which people diagnose mental illness. And it doesn't really single out apathy and emptiness as a condition on its own, as the comments we just quoted mentioned, but it is a contributing factor on a couple things like depression and so-called borderline personality disorder, which isn't quite the same emptiness that we're talking about here. That's more boredom, leaving people to undertake risky behaviors. It's more the kind associated with depression that we're talking about here. A sense of purposelessness in life and sort of the feelings of darkness that brings on. And so the research that our source went over did argue that while it hasn't received the attention that other things have, it is widespread and serious nonetheless, right? And this is just as we'd expect, given a world of free time and leisure, wherein people suddenly have the time and opportunity to reflect upon the pointlessness and futility of life, unlike many times and places in human history where people were just struggling to survive. All right, so having talked now about apathy and emptiness in general, we're going to turn our attention to the second of these consequences here, which is depression. So we have another source here, right? So we picked out just one. Like I say, you can certainly do more research on these, but this source is from Business Insider here, talking about depression in young people especially. So just as I pulled out some quotes from the last one, I'm going to pull out some quotes from this one, and this one even has a picture. A good quote here, introducing the topic here, and especially this idea that depression is getting worse. It's not getting better, even in our modern circumstances where we've solved all these issues in life. Well, here's their introductory quote. So, over the past decade, more and more people in nearly every age group, financial bracket, and circumstance across the country have reported worrying symptoms. They're losing interest in life, lacking zest for learning new things, and finding that activities they previously enjoyed feel meaningless. But nowhere is this troubling trend more notable than among young people, as shown in a study published last week in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. So the upshot from this is that while mental health conditions do naturally vary across age groups, so they might affect young people more, or middle-aged people more, or elderly people more, well, in this case specifically, in our modern time, nowhere are the problematic trends more worrisome than in young people. So this is specifically about Gen Z here. People born in the early 2000s, but particularly college students as well, as we'll get to when we get to the chart here. So that was the introductory quote from this article. And you can see here, they're tracking from 2009 to 2017 is the range on the statistics here. And you could probably find line graphs for a longer temporal stretch if you wanted to compare to, say, the 1980s and the 1990s. But you can see just over this over this date range here from 2009 to 2017, you can see the lines are labeled by age group here. You can see the upward trend, especially in young people, right? So hasn't changed so much in the elderly, but in young people who are going through the process of graduating college, finding a job, getting married, buying houses, doing all the things that young adults do. Well, all of these young people, so ages 12 all the way through 25 here, or even 29, you can see that these rates are going up. And this is the problem that we're talking about here, the depression that people face. And this is, again, somewhat related to the apathy and emptiness. It's a contributing factor to depression. As you can see here, right, the activities they previously enjoyed feel meaningless. But this trend right here is why we say that despite the progress being made in large, wide-scale human terms, well, it doesn't necessarily translate into purpose and meaning and happiness in the lives of individuals. Because despite all of this societal progress, people are reporting higher and higher levels of individual depression. And one of the most ultimate consequences of depression, left untreated to go to its scary conclusion, not that all depressed people commit suicide or that it's necessarily a natural consequence, but the two are related. Well, suicide is perhaps the scariest symptom of this pointlessness that people feel. So this time, we're going to actually look at a source from the government. So this is the National Institute of Mental Health, putting out an article on statistics here. And so you can see this table talks about causes of death and how it ranks in different age groups, right? And so you can see for young people, 15 through 24 and 25 through 34, right? These are when people are pretty healthy in their life. Well, suicide is actually the second largest cause of death in these people, only after unintentional injury. So suicide is actually quite a bit higher than homicides. So the number of people who kill themselves rather than being killed by others is substantially higher in these groups. And then it falls off, as the statistics we saw earlier, as people get older. Now, the thing that we are more interested in is how it's changing over time. And we'll get to this chart in a second here, but we go ahead and read a couple quotes from this one as well. So these links will all be in the slides here when we post them. But first quote, so quote, "Suicide is a major public health concern. Suicide is among the leading causes of death in the United States. Based on recent mortality data, suicide in some populations is on the rise." Again, we'll see that chart in a second here. So this is something from the part of the webpage summarizing the statistics, the trend lines over time here. Where are we? Oh, I think I already scrolled past it. It is up here, right here. So in this paragraph, we have a description of the suicide rate here. And so just to give an indication of the scale we're talking about here, it says the total age-adjusted suicide rate in the United States increased 35.2%. from 10.5 per 100,000 in 1999 to 14.2 per 100,000 in 2018, before declining to 13.9 per 100,000 in 2019. So these may not seem like super high numbers, but it's the percentage increase that is of interest to us here. You can see the trend lines here on this line graph. So from 1999 to 2019, which is when this study was, I suppose data courtesy of the CDC here, so United States Centers for Disease Control. And you'll notice here that there is a very wide gap between men and women in suicide. So the blue represents men, the green down on the bottom represents women. And this has been well studied. Men are more likely to commit suicide and in particular, more likely to be successful at it. And so men have, as you can see, more than 3 times the suicide rate here. Especially young men, as we were tracking here in the statistics. This one isn't broken out by age demographics, but it tracks similar to the depression graph here. And so there you have it. So those are 3 consequences that we mentioned of people who face this existential pointlessness, this futility by being adrift in the world without spiritual purpose. So this is why convincing people to believe, why evangelism should be taken to be so important for us as Christians, because people who aren't saved, who don't have spiritual things as a guiding force in their life, fall prey to these things way, way more than Christians do. I actually don't have any statistics in this presentation for it, but one of the greatest protective factors against depression and suicide and other negative mental health outcomes is actually being part of a religious group. Now, this isn't particularly unique to Christianity. A big part of it is mediated through social interaction, but having that spiritual purpose is huge. And of course, for us as Christians, we believe that things that aren't Christianity aren't true. So Christianity happens to be the correct spiritual path, but nonetheless, it is the case that once people get on with having their lives guided by spiritual purpose, they avoid much of the existential pointlessness that is faced by unbelievers otherwise. And so back to the main point that we were seeking to bolster with our discussion today, despite all of our progress, despite all of the positive PR spin that people put on modernity, it's still true that the futility shines through all the more in our modern day, where despite having all of these blessings, people are actually less satisfied, less happy with life. And here we've argued in the context of our study that these trends make perfect sense because without God, life really is pointless. And so to the extent that people have become less preoccupied just surviving, just meeting their basic needs, getting by, such that they actually have more time to think and contemplate and ponder the universe and existence, well, to that extent, the void will stare them more directly in the face, which has consequences such as the ones we've gone over here. Now, sneak preview of what we will be talking about. With everything we've said being true, it's nonetheless the case that many people successfully distract themselves from the realities. So if one possible reaction to all this is to get depressed and fall into this apathy and emptiness, the darkness over your life, because you come to realize and contemplate the futility of material existence, well, if that's one possible outcome, many people, rather than getting depressed, actually choose to distract themselves, right? To pretend that these realities don't exist, that they don't apply to them. So this is analogous to the commonly used metaphor of ostriches sticking their head in the sand, right? So people stick their heads in the sand, trying to instead distract themselves from all of the existential futility that faces them in life. But to the main point of us talking about all this, we've now gone through some actual data here. And this wasn't supposed to be the most rigorous thing ever. This was supposed to just be introducing the ideas here, introducing that these things do have rigorous statistical basis. We're not just making things up here. About these consequences that people face as a result of not believing the truth. And of course, as I say, not all unbelievers do this. Some unbelievers successfully distract themselves instead. But it is true that despite all of our progress, people are not just glowingly happy in our modern world. And in fact, negative outcomes like depression and suicide are increasing, not decreasing. All right, so now to turn to something completely different. One of the other points we covered in our lesson this week was this idea that human insatiability is or human desire is completely insatiable, so that only the unattained and the unattainable are actually truly attractive to us as humans. And so a sentiment that a lot of people who aren't rich have when they hear this is that, well, if I were rich, I wouldn't be dissatisfied, right? If I were in those people's circumstances, I wouldn't act like them. So many people are skeptical that they themselves would ever desire more if only they were to achieve the level of wealth that some others actually do enjoy. So people who think like this, well, most of them believe a few things. They have these beliefs in common. So the first one is that the media reports about the dissatisfaction of the rich and powerful are either false, meaning the rich and powerful secretly enjoy pleasurable and fulfilling lives and the media just gets it wrong, or that it's because of the weak moral character of these people that they experience a lust for more and a dissatisfaction with their already grand estate. So that is to say that these people are viewed as necessarily being the authors of their own problems and dissatisfaction, rather than it being something, inherent to human nature or outside of their control. So it's the fault of the rich people, basically. If only they were more moral, they wouldn't have these problems. And so a second belief here, shared among people who think like this, is that if they themselves were in the same circumstances, they would certainly be happy and content and not chase after more in futility like those present fools. So they think in their heads, it's because those rich people lack moral backbone. I would be different and better. I wouldn't fall into the same traps as them. I wouldn't be discontent with the silver spoon in my mouth. So people think this. They think mean things about rich people, and they think that they'd be better if they were in the same circumstances. So in this way, thus it is that many people categorically reject the teaching that human desire is insatiable, thinking along the lines of it's only insatiable for people that aren't them. Now, we have some right to be skeptical here. So maybe, and it's not really our place. It is kind of between people and God. So perhaps some of these people are correct in their assessment that if they were blessed with wealth, they would use it well, and live satisfying, fulfilling lives, perhaps lives of service, helping others with their wealth. Well, maybe it's possible. However, some things militate against taking them at their word, especially when they're outspoken about all this. Like if only they were rich, they would be better. So 3 points here, and you could go on. These are just examples of why skepticism is perhaps warranted here. So first one is just the observation of actual living, breathing humans who do gain wealth and power. So there's a very famous saying here. A guy named Lord Acton, is a British guy, says power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? Quite famous. And so this is the idea that gaining lots of money and power yields temptations far beyond what most people face in their lives of more humble means. And so what we mean by that is that people who are rich and powerful have all these situations that they can kind of exploit, all these things that they can do and get away with on account of things that none of us could actually get away with given our own normal station, right? So rich people can commit a crime and hire a lawyer and get out of the consequences, just for example. That doesn't mean that all rich people do that and all rich people are evil or anything like that, but they have the possibility to do that, which is something that a lot of people don't. And so this is the idea that temptation increases along with your wealth and power. And so people think that they'd be better off if they were rich, but actually what wealth is in most ways for us as a Christian is wealth is actually a difficult test, the so-called prosperity test. It's a trap because the richer you are, the more temptation you have to ignore God and to trust in yourself and your own material goods for your own deliverance rather than spiritual ends. And so I'm going through all this because this saying here, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, yeah, that has lots and lots of historical evidence behind it. So history and common experience, just observation of others, even in our own personal lives, tell us that most people fall to the temptations rather than effectively resist it. And so the arrogance here is that people think that they'd be different if they were the ones in these circumstances, even though statistically most people fall to the temptations. They think that they'd be different. So no matter what the intentions were from the outset. So many people might strive after wealth. So for example, if they grew up poor, they might want to, make a lot of money so they can give scholarships to people who are like them, right? So people from their ethnic group or people who face similar challenging circumstances, the guy who gets to med school out of the slums, wants to go help other people from the community he grew up in, things like that, right? So even if they have the purest intentions, well, because of this corrupting influence of power and money, well, people who start out, even with the best of intentions, sometimes slip down that slippery slope, and then they end up in the same state as all the rest of them, right? Ever lusting after more, abusing their power and influence, and all of these other negative things. And again, just to be clear, it's not all rich people, right? We can't categorically condemn people. All we're saying is that there is temptation there. There is pressures that come from having wealth and power that us normal people don't have to deal with. And we should never forget that, so it's not an unqualified good. All right, so I don't get too off in the weeds there. That was the first point here of why perhaps we should be a little bit skeptical when people assert that they would do so much better in these circumstances, right? Because this one is basically saying, well, human nature is to not do so much better because power and money corrupt. And that's it's a true statement. It's something that has to be resisted, and history and personal observation can back this up quite easily. So second point here in favor of being a little bit skeptical of when people say this is that scientific research concerning the fact that human perception and memory is incredibly self-serving. So people think well of themselves and they remember things in such a way that they don't come out being the person at fault. So most people rate their own moral choices as far superior to others when in fact they are just as bad, if not worse. An example I give here is that of murderers and terrorists. So most people who are murderers and terrorists feel that their causes are righteous, that they aren't bad people, which to the rest of us seems completely incongruous with their actions. But to them, they don't think that they're evil in their hearts. Now, there are exceptions. And in fact, people who are hyper-religious tend to have this sentiment of no matter how good they are, they always feel like they're inadequate, sort of the reverse, the opposite of this. But where we're going with this is that it's just in human cognition to think too highly of yourself, right? And I include this here, right? All of us, it's not just those people, the third party over there. All of us have this tendency within hardwired into our brains to think that we're better than we really are, that we don't struggle with things as much as we really do because our body betrays us. Our mind plays tricks on us and remembers things in such a way that it doesn't seem like we have the problems that other people do. So we're much more likely to be hard on other people than we are to be on ourselves. And as I say, this has research behind it. We're not just waving our hand here. There's actual science, there's psychology that is well understood, well described, that explains these phenomena. So that's second point, to be skeptical here. And third one is just that talk is cheap and words are wind. So people can say whatever they want, but it's easy to say that you would be righteous and great from the armchair if only God would bless you with wealth, right? So if only you had these opportunities and circumstances, then, well, yes, everyone, of course, they'd say they'd be great, right? Because words are cheap. Talk is cheap, words are wind. So people can just assert things. And who knows? Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but because it will never happen, it's not possible to prove them wrong. And I include this question here, right? Did you ever wonder why God doesn't, right? You know, these people who say they'd be so great if God would just give them wealth. Well, God is in perfect control of the universe, and he does what's best for us and what's best for all people, actually. His plan is perfect. So if God doesn't give you money and assets and power, well, he's not giving them to you for a reason, right? And so people who aren't humble enough to ask that question of, well, why isn't God giving it to me? Well, obviously, if they think they deserve it, right, and they think God's wrong, they're not really respecting God's vision, you know, God's ability to plan effectively throughout the entire universe. So all of these things together, and mind you, like I said, perhaps some of these people really are correct in their appraisal of things, and perhaps God really will. You know, some people do become self-made millionaires and that sort of thing. But in fact, the reason why this doesn't hold for most of us is that most of us would not successfully navigate the immense pressures that come with such things as great money and power, right? We mentioned the temptations up here, the fact that we think we do a lot better than we really would, and the fact that, well, people can say whatever they want, but it's a lot harder than just saying it. And so here's the real upshot for us as Christians is because there are no hypotheticals, we can only do the best with what is actually before us personally, which is what is actually best for us, because God knows way better than we do, and he doesn't make mistakes. So that is to say, we are in the circumstances we are in out of God's perfect plan. So for us and for all humans. And we didn't end up here by accident. God didn't put us here by accident. It's not as if we were born down in the slums whereas we really deserve to be in the palace or any nonsense like that, right? All of us are put here for a very specific purpose. And we know in any case that these distinctions that we're talking about anyway, none of these things matter in eternity, right? Because our rewards in eternity won't be based on how great we are in the world, but it'll be based on how much we responded to God. So it's actually of no moment whatsoever our present material circumstances. But anyway, that's getting a little off topic there. So we're still on this topic of here that people saying that they certainly wouldn't be dissatisfied if only they were rich, if only God blessed them with the things that other people have. So I want to close off this discussion here, right? These things here are the meat and potatoes. This is why, even though we can't in 100% of cases say people are wrong, but we can at least be a little bit skeptical in this. And actually more to our point, we shouldn't probably go around asserting this ourselves because it's not something that we can really know. But on top of all that, I want to use here as the analogy of this sort of sentiment here. When people say, oh, I certainly wouldn't be dissatisfied if I were rich. I'd be moral. I'd be a good person unlike those rich people over there. And they try to draw some sort of categorical distinction. It's really actually very little different than from people saying things like this. So saying, if I were in Peter's shoes, I wouldn't have denied Christ. Or if I were Elijah, I wouldn't have acted cowardly and run from Jezebel. Or if I were Moses, I wouldn't have struck the rock. Right? So these great believers in the Bible, right? People say, oh, well, I could have done better than them. If I were in their circumstances, I would have done better. You know, people think of this as not just Peter, but the disciples in general. If I were next to Jesus physically, I would have been a great believer. I would have been even better than them, right? Some people actually think that. It seems kind of insane to me, but people really do. And so a general principle here, and this is what I want to close with, just tying things back in a little broader sense, and then making the general principle and then the specific one from this, right? So in a general sense, until we admit our own insufficiency and humble ourselves, we will never be able to act as God wants us to. So if people actually believe things like this in their heart, so that they would have been better if only they were given the same chance. Well, then it's kind of hard to lead them by the hand, because then they're always sitting around angry at how they aren't getting the opportunities they think they deserve, right? Whereas we just said that God actually puts all of us exactly where we're supposed to be. God doesn't make mistakes. Well, if people walk around always angry because they think God isn't giving them what they actually deserve, well, then they're only going to be able to go so far in spiritual growth, right? Because they're going to put up this barrier. They're going to say, why am I not rich and powerful and famous? And, why don't I have all the things I want, God? This isn't fair because I'm so righteous, right? That's the exact opposite of the mentality we need to have as Christians, right? Rather than the idea that we are just unworthy servants doing our duty, right? That's how we should be, right? God blesses us with eternal reward and even rewards in this life for good behavior, but he doesn't have to, because we don't deserve anything, right? We are by nature people who sin, people who are deserving of God's wrath and judgment, until God sent his son to die for us, to take our sins on his shoulders on the cross so that we might be redeemed unto him. So who are we to say, hey, God, I deserve this. Why aren't you giving me this? So that's the general sense. But here specifically, as long as we are in this world, we're going to struggle with the lust of the flesh, including covetousness. And that's what drives the insatiability of human desire, right? This desire to have what other people have. So we are not especially immune from the dangers of insatiable human desire here as Christians. We are not special. And believing otherwise is just setting us up for a fall, right? So if people actually walk around thinking, you know what, it's not fair, God, because if I had what they had, I'd be better than them. I would handle it better. I wouldn't be dissatisfied. I wouldn't go chasing after more because I'd count the blessings I already have. Well, it's easy to say that, but the reason why we really shouldn't get in the habit of thinking like this and thinking that, oh, I would be different if only I got what I wanted, right, is because it sets us up on that hamster wheel of futility in life, right? People go chasing after these things, thinking they'll make them happy, only to get there and then not be happy, right? And so this plays out time and time again. This is what we were going over. It's what we will continue to go over in coming weeks in the study here. But if we try to convince ourselves that we are somehow different, that the laws that govern the rest of the world that are repeatable and predictable, and you can see the statistics back them up. Well, if we think that somehow we're an exception to those laws, then that's completely insane. It doesn't make any sense. However, that's how many, many people think. And that's why people won't always notice this futility that we're talking about here, right? Because they think that they're an exception to it, that the laws of the universe just don't apply to them, because they would be different. They would be better, right? And that sort of thinking, as I say here, will make it so that we can't actually do what God wants for us, right? So if we have this feeling of entitlement, well, then we are going to be seriously held back from fulfilling our mission and our duty as Christians. All right, so here's the things that we talked about here. We talked about the data here for backing up that claim that we made, that despite all this progress that humanity has made, the consequences of human hopelessness are actually getting worse, right? So apathy and emptiness, depression and suicide, and how all that proves the point that we made, that as people have more time, as they are able to contemplate the futility of life down here under the sun, life without God, as it stares them in the face, well, then if they don't turn to God, if they double down in their unbelief, then all of these things are a rational response to that futility, right? Sad as it is. And then we also here talked about how this idea of how we'd be different if we had more isn't necessarily a godly perspective for us as Christians. It's not something that we should really encourage as a thought pattern. So in coming weeks here, so our next lesson in Q&A, we will probably be talking about distraction, right? We brought that up here, right? Saying that as opposed to the consequences of the futility here, some people manage to successfully distract themselves. And in fact, most people do. This is probably the more common pattern here of people sticking their heads in the sand. If they reject God, and rather than look at the existential pointlessness that should drive them to God, they instead decide to distract themselves. And so that's what we will be talking about here when we next pick up.